And the last lecture of the series that we have organized this year, this academic year, with my colleague, Professor Anna Ewert. And we have a great pleasure to welcome today our distinguished guest, Professor Simone Pfenninger from the University of Salzburg. And just by brief introduction, the series is of invited lecture series in bilingualism and multilingualism. It's organized jointly by the Institute for Advanced Studies, by the Faculty of English at Adam Mickiewicz University, and the Poznań branch of Bilingualism Matters. And throughout this academic year, we have had the pleasure and honor to welcome many distinguished guests, outstanding researchers, and world experts in the fields of bilingualism and multilingualism. And last but not least, today we welcome with great pleasure our friend and colleague, Professor Simone Pfenninger from the University of Salzburg. Simone is Associate Professor of Second Language Acquisition and Psycholinguistics in the Department of English and American Studies at the University of Salzburg. She's a co-editor of the Second Language Acquisition book series, which is published by Multilingual Matters. Simone has held various functions, such as the Vice President of the International Association of Multilingualism, Vice President of the European Second Language Association, Eurosla. She has published extensively and in many outstanding journals and book publications, and her principal research areas involve, apart from multilingualism and psycholinguistics, she focuses on the age factor in SLA, on quantitative approaches, statistical methods, and techniques for language application in education, as well as EFL at different levels, and the assessment of the process of language education and language policy. And today, Professor Pfenninger will be talking about becoming bilingual later in life, and she'll be presenting her thoughts on affective and cognitive between and within person variability. Simone, without further ado, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Magda. Thank you, Anna, for inviting me and for giving me the privilege to wrap up this lecture series. And thanks everyone for joining wherever you are. I'm going to try and share my screen with you now. I hope that looks good on your end.
It does. Thank you so much.
Very good. Okay, as Magda said, so this is about becoming bilingual later in life. And I would like to start with a quote by Magdalena Wrembel and Kees de Bott, who recently said that there is no new behavior if there's no variability. So for example, there can be no second language development if there are no ups and downs, if there's no trial and error. And this quote implicates at least two things, I would argue. It implicates that variability and its opposite, stability, are indispensable aspects of human development. And on the other hand, it implicates that variability somehow, somewhere, no matter how it's defined, is functional, it's meaningful, it's indicative of growth or of impairment, but it carries meaning. And that is by no means a new idea or a new insight. It goes back at least to the 1990s when in developmental psychology, Fallon and Smith suggested that intra-individual variability, specifically, they said, contains valuable information about human development. However, I would argue that particularly in recent years, maybe in the last decade, research on variability in SLA, in the cognitive neurosciences, has received a great impetus from particularly the advent of new techniques, new tests, new statistical tests that allow us to model variability. I don't want to say properly, but just probably more accurately, I should say. And that has made a great impact on the fields I work in. I work in second language acquisition and psycholinguistics, and we do research on the acquisition and use of multiple languages across the lifespan. And today, as announced, I would like to delve into the third age, so later in life. second language learner later in life, which is a unique endeavor. I mean, this is really unlike the learning of anything else. As many of you know, second language learning on the one hand represents this really stimulating, complex cognitive task. And on the other hand, it is socially engaging. It is ecologically purposeful and relevant. It is meaningful. It involves identity construction. And it's exactly this cognition-affect interface that I'm personally very interested in. And I would like to focus on this interface with you in relation to L2 learning in older adults. Now, third-age additional language learning has really been gaining traction in recent years. I'm not sure whether you felt that, but you can almost feel that surge in research studies. But I think still much needs to be explored as to how older adults learn a completely new language from scratch, and what language learning brings them, cognitively speaking, for example, particularly in light of hypotheses such as Ryan and Journey's idea that language learning may be some kind of anti-aging activity. And so I would argue with, for example, Vander, Ploch, Kaiser, and Lowie that if we investigate something as complex as aging, we have to sort of attack it from a lot of different research perspectives. And so far, previous studies that look, for example, into the effect of second language learning on cognitive functioning, they're all based on mean trends, and they involve between 1, 2, or a maximum of 3 data collection points. So the field is relatively homogeneous, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to come in sort of from a different angle, as you will see today, because recently I found that in many research, but also applied settings across the social, behavioral, but also health sciences, it's been suggested that it's actually variability rather than mean trends and group averages that is of key interest, and that is really interesting. And that's something that we're doing because we are interested in inner and intra-individual variation, which if you look at older adults is through the roof, as you can imagine. We know that variable behavior is exacerbated with increasing age. For example, differences in cognitive ability in general increase with age. So you may have individuals, for example, who show very stable cognitive performance in cognitive tests, even in the presence of structural and functional decline. And this has been attributed to, for example, lifestyle factors, demographic factors, socially and mentally stimulating leisure activities, anything really from the environment you find yourself in as an older adult to nutrition, physical activity, music, overall health, but also previous L2 experience, for example, lifelong multilingualism also seems to, or it's been suggested that it may have an impact on between inter-individual variation. And that's also something that we've observed in the field of second language acquisition. We know that with increasing age, the learner's second language results become more dispersed. Goals for second language learning become more diverse, and their effects of progressive first language entrenchment and education. So lots of inter-individual variation, between person variation there. And what I find particularly interesting is that all of these, shall we call them, individual differences, variables that are listed here and that impact on either cognitive functioning or L2 development, they not only have an impact on cognitive functioning and L2 development, but they also interact with each other continuously, dynamically over time. And these interactions between variables that we know contribute to the explanation of SLA, they very often go beyond rigid linear relationships. What does that mean? I'm going to give you an example from Serafini. It's a beautiful study that came out in 2017. She found that working memory capacities and socioaffective aspects, for example, language learning motivation, they interact very differently in beginning versus intermediate versus advanced second language learners. So it highly depends on the proficiency level of your participants, whether you do find an interaction there or not, and how strong that interaction is. So the curve is very much, non-linear. Serafina focused on young adults, but even if we venture into the third age, we find studies such as Brose and colleagues who found reduced cognition-affect covariation in older adults. That's another nonlinear relationship. So they found that apparently there is less of a correlation between cognitive functioning and affect, for example, enjoyment, or again, your motivation to learn something new in older versus younger adults. And they attributed that to, they call it a stabilization of affective variability across the lifespan. So apparently, as we get older, our affective reactions to events or new things that we learn decrease. And it also has to do with probably with duties and daily duties or opportunities really to engage in personally relevant activities that vary more in younger adults versus more routinized lives of older adults. You will also see today that whenever you work with older adults, whenever they learn something new, for example, in the context of a third age university, very often they show very high levels of intrinsic motivation. They really want to learn these new skills because there's very little societal pressure anymore. So they're intrinsically motivated, very self-determined, also trying to satisfy their need for autonomy. And so there's less variance usually in socioaffective variables. And so therefore you can see less of a cognition-affect covariation basically. I'll come back to that a little later if you find that confusing. Brose and colleagues also very much emphasized in that paper that within and between person links between motivation and cognitive performance are generally not equivalent, especially not in old age. And that leads us from between person variability, inter-individual variation to intra-individual variation, because even within an individual, cognitive functioning or socioaffective variables or L2 development, if you want, are far from stable. They manifest significant fluctuations occurring at different time scales across the lifespan, across years, months, days, daily occasions separated by hours, or even moments separated by minutes and seconds. So right now that you're listening to me, your motivation to attend to this talk will go up and down from maybe second to second, depending on your overall stress level, your interest in the topic, the oxygen level in your room, your blood sugar level, and so on. So there's a lot of variability there. And second, language development in and of itself has also been described as being about nonlinear change over time, whatever the time scale is, particularly within the framework of complex dynamic systems theory, which is, in a nutshell, it's a meta theory of change, predominantly nonlinear change. And within that theoretical framework, individual differences variables, for example, language learning, motivation, anxiety, willingness to communicate, engagement, investment, and so on. It's also been suggested that we can't look at them as being stable, modular, context-independent traits. We should look at them as dynamic entities that fluctuate over time within an individual. And importantly, it's also been suggested or hypothesized that individual learner differences they differentially impact on L2 development at different moments in time. So language learning motivation will not always have the same impact on your L2 development. And as you will see today, it takes a very specific research design to put this hypothesis to test. Finally, as the introductory quote suggested, there's this idea that intra-individual variation may be functional or meaningful or indicative of something. This has been suggested in developmental psychology, as I said before, where large intra-individual variation in children was suggested to be indicative of a disorder or some kind of learning difference, such as dyslexia, specific language impairment, ADHD, and so on. Similarly, in the cognitive neurosciences, large intra-individual variation is very often associated with impairment, vulnerability, poorer cognitive functioning in cognitive tests. Recently, however, there have been studies, and I find that really interesting, that saw it as a sign of adaptation and sort of reflecting greater cognitive specialization. So apparently it's not entirely negative. And that is reminiscent of our discussion in second language acquisition, where, as I said before, intra-individual variation has been described or hypothesized as a potential driving force of L2 development. And, sorry, I missed the and here, and it's a source of information, both quantitatively, with data showing fluctuating levels of the variables of interest, and qualitatively, in the sense that multidimensional juxtapositions can also be illustrated for each measurement occasion. But I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So it isolates something good, apparently. Now that, for me, as always, when I've read through these fields, the question has come up as to how intra-individual variation is defined, or what they mean by that, because obviously it refers to variation within an individual, fluctuations within an individual, but there are different types of intra-individual variation, as you surely you know. So, for example, we can distinguish between different types of intra-individual variation. I use the abbreviation IAV here as a function of the time period considered. So, for example, there's intra-individual variation across trials within tasks. For example, trials within a working memory task or a reaction times task, or a second language task, for example, a composition, where in variationist SLA, we look at how learners vary their use of grammatical structures or forms, such as the third person singular S, forms that are usually not variable in the input that they receive. For example, supplying the third person singular S in its obligatory context. There's usually not much variability there, but yet this person here seems to sort of switch between providing it and not providing it, right? He trained, then he trains, then back to he trained. And it doesn't really matter whether they're being systematic or not, whether this is use or user-related variation. The person is not being consistent. We call this inconsistency. So variation within an individual and within a task. Then there's intra-individual variation across different types of tasks, sometimes called effects of task type. So you may do really well on one task and written task, and then really poorly on another task, right? And we call this dispersion, sometimes referred to as heterogeneity. So that's a type of intra-individual variation. And then finally, there is variation within one and the same individual, within one and the same type of task, but that task is administered repeatedly over time. In time serial data of repeated observations. Some scholars call this variability. For lack of a better term, I'll follow them, but it is slightly misleading because variability is often also just used as a sort of a cover term for everything intra-individual. But we'll use that term for the moment. And so this really follows, the idea here really is that the outcome of linguistic variation at one moment in time directly influences the likelihood of a matching outcome some moments later. The sociolinguists and corpus linguists among you might notice as the phenomenon of persistence. In psycholinguistics, we call this priming. It's the same effect. In SLA, it's sometimes referred to as L2 developmental change. So really what you do is you administer the same task repeatedly over days, weeks, years here in this case. And then obviously what you observe is sort of temporal clustering, temporal non-independence, because your performance at one moment in time directly influences your performance the next moment, and so on and so forth. In statistics, it's sometimes called autocorrelation. It's the same principle. And so we have three types of intra-individual variation: inconsistency, dispersion, and variability. And I was wondering, which of these three types can we take as providing insight into the developmental process? Because whenever we read about intra-individual variation as being a source of information, it's never specified what type of intra-individual variation is at play here, and what is a sign of impairment, what is a good sign, what is a bad sign. And that is one of the questions that we asked ourselves in a large-scale longitudinal project that is called, I should say, was called DINAGE, or Dynamic Analysis of Language Learning in the Third Age. We're about to wrap this up now, so this is very much in the past already. It was a project that we launched in Salzburg back in the day, but it's very much a collaboration with the University of Zurich. And what we basically did is we carried out two independent studies, one in Zurich, one in Salzburg. And we used the exact same research design, very similar research questions, different samples, just to increase the validity of our research. And so very briefly, in Zurich, we carried out an intervention study over a period of 8 months. And as you know, in intervention studies, you have several groups of participants. So we had a so-called experimental group of 28 participants, older adults between 64 and 75 years of age, who learned Spanish from scratch. They had absolutely no knowledge of Spanish beforehand. They learned Spanish through the use of Duolingo, which I trust you know, it's that learning software, and through traditional classroom-based L2 Spanish instruction. Then we had an active control group of 17 older adults who played with a computerized real-time strategy game. It's called Die Siedler. It's very similar to that Microsoft game called Rise of Nations. It's a game that has been found to yield all different kinds of cognitive benefits, but it does not involve the acquisition and the use of a new language, right? And then we had a passive control group of participants who just came in for the testing. And we made sure to control these three groups for all different kinds of individual differences, from, yes, age to their L1. They were healthy older adults, no impairments, no deficits. We tried to make the groups more or less comparable there. As you can see, the sample size is relatively small, too small probably to answer quantitative research questions. But what we did is we decided to test each participant on a weekly basis. So rather than testing them twice, at the beginning, at the end of the training, every week. And so each participant was represented by 30 measurements over a period of 8 months. And that yielded 2,000 data collection points per task and test. So 2,000 interviews, 2,000 working memory tasks, 2,000 of everything we administered. So it's a huge amount of data that you don't get in via sample size, having thousands of participants, but via data collection points. And in Salzburg, we pretty much did the same thing. But you can see at first glance, we had an additional active control group of participants who just came in for social interaction, chit chat over coffee and cake. What else was different? They learned English rather than Spanish in Salzburg. And they were slightly older. Well, the range was sort of wider. They were between 61 and 79 years of age. And sadly, what happened here is that we only carried out this intervention study over 6 months because we got hit by COVID after 15 measurements. And so we had to wrap this up halfway through the training. But as you will see, the data is still meaningful. 15 measurements actually did the trick too. And so very briefly, every week we ask them to complete a battery of L2 proficiency tests, Spanish or English, depending on where they were, written, oral, receptive, productive tests. We had a battery of 8 cognitive measures, the usual simple, complex working memory, attention, alertness, inhibition, verbal fluency. And we carried out interviews. We administered written questionnaires and sliders to get in qualitative and quantitative data about all different kinds of socioaffective variables, from language learning motivation to well-being, engagement, investment, identity construction, and so on. And so to just sum this up again, all the participants completed this test battery every week. And the participants in the experimental group on top of that learned English and Spanish respectively in a classroom setting, and then in Zurich on top of that using Duolingo over a period of 8 months and 6 months respectively. Now, I've often been asked, why would you sacrifice sample size in favor of multiple data collection points? And there are many reasons for that, starting with the fact that with older adults, as I said before, it's very hard to have large groups of participants and then try to generalize to the overall population. So looking at the individual is invaluable. That said, I always also emphasize that, you know, the application of such a person-centered approach does not mean you reject traditional longitudinal studies with a classical pre-post test design. This very much complements the L2 frameworks that were developed in recent decades. It just allows us to answer completely different and new research questions. To give you an example, I am less interested in whether cognitive functioning, socioaffective variables, age, multilingualism, education, whether they impact on language learning success. I'm not so much interested in that. I'm interested in over what time these ID variables work and for whom. So this is about temporally limited effects. This is about dynamic interactions that I've talked about before. This is about nonlinearity of processes. We can also answer questions such as who profits from second language learning in old age and when, and those are crucial questions that inform our interventions with older adults. If I have multiple data collection points per person, it allows me to model periods of significant growth or periods of significant decline. And then I can have a look at what characterizes periods of significant growth. What happens when you experience a growth spurt or sort of a dip in your development? Is there some type of intra-individual variation that is particularly salient during those periods and therefore could be considered a required byproduct of the learning process? So those were questions that we raised and that we tried to answer basically. And so our study very much sort of like a hybrid finds itself in the process-oriented longitudinal realm of quantitative SLA studies, but sort of in between classical longitudinal group studies with large samples and the classical pre-post test design, and these new microgenetic case studies that are very much inspired by complex dynamic systems theory with lots of different data collection points, but they're usually limited to a handful of cases. We try to sort of squeeze in the middle. We have intensive data and larger groups of participants. Basically, the point really is that we try to strike a balance between variability and generalizability. I mean, that's really the catch, that we try to make sure to account for high levels of intra-individual variation, which is very prevalent in old age, but at the same time, we would like to provide accounts of these complex dynamic systems, accounts that go beyond the individual case, because we very often have to inform policymakers, education politicians, teachers, parents. And so you would like to make a little more general statements and draw more general conclusions. And that's something that we are able to do with such a research design through the use of, we use generalized additive mixed modeling. I'm not going to go into detail here. I can highly recommend it for nonlinear longitudinal data. It's absolutely beautiful. But we always also include qualitative data, as you will see in a moment. So that's it for the research design. Now, I thought I could show you some of the most exciting results of the last 6 years, starting with the good news. In both Zurich and Salzburg, the participants in the experimental groups who learned English and Spanish respectively, they made significant growth with respect to those languages. They did great. They learned those languages really well. You can see here how the Spanish learners in Zurich performed with respect to the 7 Spanish measures. For anything from grammar reception to oral fluency, you can see here the group trajectories, and it becomes obvious at first glance that they made particularly, they showed a particularly salient growth spurt in the initial stages of acquisition, sort of the first 15 weeks, that's the time axis here, which is illustrated by these bold overlays, which are superimposed periods of significant growth modeled on the GAM, the generalized additive models. And so there seems to be something going on in the initial, sort of halfway through the training in the initial stages. What you can also see here, obviously, is that the effect of time was nonlinear for most of these measures, but this one here, that was oral developmental morphosyntactic accuracy, where you can find a significant linear increase across the board for that group, which has to do with what you measure and how you measure it. But there is growth. Now, what we have to keep in mind, though, is that these are group trajectories. And so if we look at the individuals, the picture looks a bit different. You can see here, for example, how the 26 participants in Salzburg performed with respect to overall L2 English proficiency, lexical comprehension, and in the reception of grammar tests. And you can see at first glance that they not only differ by the speed of their development, they do not develop along similar paths either by any means. It looks a bit like spaghetti noodles. So huge between person variation, which was exemplified by the subject-related random effects, which were through the roof across the tests. You can also see here, though, that there is a bit of a trend. I mean, most of them show some kind of growth spurt initially, and then this is followed by a more stable phase. And I'll come back to that later, but very different trajectories. Now, over what time do individual difference variables work, and for whom? We found that, unsurprisingly, in both Salzburg and Zurich with English and Spanish, basically all of the L2 measures were somehow somewhere predicted by cognitive performance. It was a super strong predictor. For example, simple working memory accuracy and its impact on lexical comprehension. But remember, that's not a research question that we're interested in. With such a research design, we are interested in cognition dynamics. For example, we found that when nonlinear patterns occurred, as you can see here, for example, with simple working memory and grammar comprehension, then the positive relationship was usually strongest at lower levels of cognitive performance. In other words, with participants who showed high levels of cognitive functioning from the outset. Variance therein did not predict L2 development. Cognitive functioning was only a strong predictor in participants with lower levels of cognitive functioning. I'm not sure whether I'm explaining this clearly, which could also point to a ceiling effect, which we sometimes see with young adults, right? Young adults make for terrible participants in studies with these cognitive tests because they perform at ceiling usually, and so there's less variance in those cognitive variables. But here we did not have a ceiling effect by any means, and so there really seems to be something to that, and I'll come back to that later. This makes for a great story, actually. We also found that there are dynamic interactions with time, and so now we add yet another layer, another dimension, that is time. And so we end up with these three-dimensional heat maps where we have the time axis, then we have some kind of cognitive tests on the y-axis, and then sort of the third dimension, like a mountain, is L2 performance, like target-like accuracy, and lighter colors represent stronger L2 performance. So you can see they get better with time. What you can also see at first glance is that these red contour lines, they change over time. They start out really narrow and steep. And then past, I said here, week 12, 15, something changes. They become more horizontal, more widespread, or more spread out. And so that means that most cognitive skills were extremely strong predictors of L2 development initially, and then they lost their significance at later stages. So later in the second half of the training, whether you showed high or low levels of cognitive performance didn't matter anymore. Again, I'll come back to that a little later. For motivation and well-being, we found that they were only predictive if below average. So again, a non-linear effect. But in this case, there was a clear ceiling effect. So we found very, very little variance in socioaffective variables, which has to do with a selection bias. Because if you think about this, who signs up for these studies? It's usually extremely motivated older adults. In our case, they were so motivated across the training, really, that they afterwards hired their English and Spanish teachers, respectively. And so they're still learning English and Spanish 2 years after the data collection ended. And so no matter whether you have a randomized controlled trial or not, you will always end up with that problem. There's a selection bias both at the moment of the point of recruitment, and then also across the training, because who drops out and who persists in the face of difficulties, right? So participant attrition also leads to that ceiling effect. And so that explains why motivation was probably not a strong predictor, and neither was well-being. There is a theoretical explanation too that reduced cognition-affect covariation in older adults. Remember that we tend to be just, I don't know, show less affective variability as we get older. It's probably a combination of both that leads to that effect. We also looked at whether it matters when adults who learned a new language, when they already knew other languages beforehand. We call that prior multilingualism. And we found a temporarily limited effect there too, in that most of the time prior multilingualism had a positive effect on the learning of a new language. Occasionally there was the occasional temporary negative effect. So for example, you can see that here beautifully, sort of in the first 10 weeks, participants who knew more languages beforehand, they had a tendency to produce more transfer effects. So what they did is they exploited their knowledge of other languages initially, and they were engaged in code switching and code mixing. And then later on that sort of leveled out and they stuck to target-like forms. And there was a similar effect, almost identical. The heat map looks almost identical with education. So more educated participants had a tendency to draw on previous knowledge of whatever. They also produce more transfer errors, which we call target-like accuracy. And so prior multilingualism did have a positive effect, sometimes a negative effect, but only in the initial stages. Again, really highly limited. I'm going to skip over age because in the interest of time, I don't want to keep you too long, and I'm going to skip right to intra-individual variation. Remember, we wanted to disentangle intra and intra-individual variation. So what we wanted to find out is, what is more important? Your global overall cognitive fitness, or how concentrated you are on a given day, how focused you are on a given day. Remember, that's the difference between intra-individual variation. So having a good day versus a bad day versus just, having overall cognitive skills. And as I said before, global cognitive performance was a very strong predictor of L2 development. Day-to-day variability was not. It was much less predictive of L2 development. So it doesn't really matter how distracted you are on a given day. It's more important in general what cognitive abilities you have. The opposite picture emerged for socioaffect. Remember, I said, for example, language learning motivation wasn't a particularly strong predictor of language learning outcomes, but how the participants felt on a given day, how motivated they were on a given day, how optimistic and positive they were, that had a huge impact on their long-term L2 development. And that, I think, has pedagogical implications, that it's extremely important how older adults feel in a classroom setting. It actually matters how they feel on a given day, whether they have a good or a bad day. And so the two variables, socioaffective and cognitive variables, they behave very differently. They have very different effects. Who then profits from second language learning and when? So that taps into the question whether L2 learning is some kind of anti-aging activity, if you want. And to answer this, we had to take the control groups into account. And remember, in Zurich, that we had two control groups, an active and a passive control group, and then LANG stands for Spanish language learning group. That's the solid line. And if we followed a solid line across these cognitive tests, from working memory to divided attention, you can see that, yes, their cognitive ability improved over time quite a bit, particularly, again, in the initial stages of acquisition, right? Sometimes it's even linear. The problem is that so did the other groups. I mean, there's literally no difference between the three groups. The shape of the trajectories the shapes are almost identical. And so there seems to be nothing special about language learning, about training. And it's the same, we found the same in Salzburg. The thing is that a micro-development approach like ours allows you to have a look at dynamic nonlinear interactions. And so what we found is that a very specific group of older adults profit from language learning. And that is individuals with low initial cognitive abilities. So people who perform poorly on the cognitive test battery, they manifested stronger cognitive improvement in the experimental rather than the control conditions. So there's something about language learning that speaks to participants with lower cognitive functioning, as opposed to other types of training or social interaction. And that's highly informative for sort of customized intervention programs. We're going to collapse the last two research questions. What we're going to do here is now we're going to zoom in on, I call them periods of significant L2 growth. What we did for each of the participants, for example, the 28 participants who learned Spanish in Zurich, and each of the L2 measures, here it's oral fluency, we modeled rapid developmental phases. Phases of significant growth, increase in blue, or phases that represent a significant decrease or a dip. That would be red, but there were very few red periods, which is beautiful. And then we had to look at what characterizes these blue periods. So if you look at subject number 13, why is their initial growth spurt here, but not here? What is going on in their lives? What are they telling us? What do they attribute their growth spurt to? And maybe, you know, how did they perform with respect to the individual differences variables in blue periods versus more stable periods? And so we can try this out with participant number 26 in Salzburg. This is a 75-year-old lady who learned English from scratch. And you can see here her performance on the C test over a period, remember, of 6 months. And you can see she demonstrates here one of those characteristic growth spurts in the first few weeks, almost halfway through the training. And this is followed by a more stable period. And so then we started having a look at the quantitative data. Remember, we had, for example, well-being, and that's the heart, and motivation, language learning motivation, that would be the index finger. And you can see at first glance that with this participant, there's a little bit of a correlation between well-being and growth, because she feels very good initially, and then her well-being levels plummet literally. And she herself told us what happened here. She said there were something extremely tragic happened here. Her husband had died, and she just she couldn't muster the energy to do anything. She felt low, she felt pessimistic. She says, she attributes this, she says that she hopes her motivation will come back, but it's not language learning motivation that went down. She loved coming to English classes. So motivation was up. It was well-being that plummeted, really. And I'll come back to that a little later. Motivation, however, didn't correlate with language growth whatsoever. You can see that here beautifully. And so this initial growth spurt cannot be attributed to training motivation. We then thought, well, maybe since so many participants show such a curve, it could have to do with the type and the intensity of the training in the second half of the intervention, that it got too difficult or too easy so that they couldn't make any more progress here. And so that would mean that we would have to adjust the training halfway through. So that has implications for the materials that you use or the techniques, the approach, anything really. Nobody really exceeded B1 level. I think it also has to do with individual differences, dynamics. Remember, we said that effects of multilingualism, prior multilingualism and education were also limited to initial stages, the first few weeks. We also said that most cognitive skills were beneficial initially, then lost their significance. And we also said that cognitive benefits as a function of the training were also more salient in the initial stages of the training. And that sort of led us to conclude in one of our papers that the cognitive benefit that results from L2 learning is also interestingly limited to stages in which the learner is actually required to tap into these capacities. And so most of these temporally limited effects are sort of restricted to here. A lot seems to go on in initial stages. And then inter-individual variation didn't really seem to make a difference anymore afterwards. Our next step then was to check whether there are more fluctuations going on here, because remember we said intra-individual variation may be functional, it may be indicative of growth. So we had a look at that, and we found that one type out of the 3 types of intra-individual variation, that was variability, was especially large during a rapid developmental phase. So it wasn't inconsistency, it wasn't dispersion, it was the 3rd type, variability, sort of the temporal type, if you want. And so we can call that a required byproduct of the learning process, but it's not intra-individual variation per se in that sense. And variability, interestingly, was also relatively higher at early stages of development, which makes sense because that's probably when learners are trying out new modes of behavior, new strategies, some correct, some incorrect incorrect, some felicitous, some infelicitous. And that seems to be a good sign. It seems to drive language development. And then finally, we had a look at the qualitative data, the interviews and the questionnaires, and we had a look at what participant number 26 said, what was going on in her life here versus here. And we carried out a prototypical content analysis, and we had to look at which themes keep coming up in blue periods versus more stable periods. And we found that learners used or referred a lot more to so-called approach-motivated emotions rather than avoidance-motivated emotions in rapid developmental phases. Approach-motivated emotions, according to Carver, Harmon, Jones, are emotions that are not expected to impair your cognitive development, whereas avoidance-motivated emotions are. And so I'll give you some examples of approach-motivated emotions. For example, subjective well-being, positive mood states. There were a lot more mentions of positive mood states in blue periods. I feel fit as a fiddle, extremely comfortable, positive, and so on. They also mentioned shame a lot more in rapid developmental phases, which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it's a very specific type of shame that was at play here. It's a feeling of being ashamed for not being able to speak English, particularly being sort of shamed by society or younger members of society. And it was interesting because with our participants, they showed a very specific reaction style related to shame. They developed sort of strategies of resilience and fight. Whenever they felt ashamed, that really motivated them, drove them to continue with the English course. They wanted to take the bull by the horns. And so those events when they felt like, they were shamed and ridiculed, they felt they wanted to do something about that, and they wanted to show them. Cognitive ability was also mentioned. So in rapid developmental phases, they said that they had better attention, concentration, retentiveness, and so on, versus feeling tired in more stable periods, feeling tired, exhausted, not really up to speed. Strategies or motivated learning behavior were also mentioned a lot more during blue periods. For example, making a conscious effort to pay attention to people speaking English, or trying to use a few sentences in English here or there. And finally, pride. Pride came up a lot in blue periods. I'm so happy whenever I need tutors to request for information in English, showing off basically. And feeling, more like part of society. And so these 5 themes kept coming up very dominantly in periods, in blue periods. So what do we make of that? There's several takeaway messages from such a microdevelopment study. For SLA scholars or the field, there are implications for this widely hypothesized meaningfulness of intra-individual variation. So we found that, yes, it can be indicative of growth, but it's a very specific type of intra-individual variation that reflects more durable within-person change. And then the others, they didn't do much in our study. And in studies in the neurocognitive sciences, these two are very often related to impairment, vulnerability. And so in our study too, they seem to be more transient and reflect reversible within-person fluctuation. The study also was supposed to demonstrate that it's important to disentangle between participant and within participant variation. Because remember, you can have certain ID variables like cognitive functioning that function very differently. So it's more important that you have very good overall cognitive skills. How you perform on a certain day doesn't really matter. How concentrated you are or how distracted you are. And with socioaffective variables, it's the opposite. Good and bad days really matter there, whereas your overall language learning motivation is less predictive. What we also found was that socioaffective and cognitive variables have very different inherent time courses. So they do not have the same effect on language learning development, language L2 development across the board and across the training. Particularly cognitive variables were very strong predictors initially, and then afterwards, the effect almost disappeared. And that has implications for us when we carry out cross-sectional studies, right, with 1 or 2 data collection points or maybe 3, which is, since the effects of these variables change over time, we can't be sure whether we might get a different effect tomorrow or next week. It's very iffy, right? So the coincidental time of the measurement is something that we very much need to have on our mind. The message for practitioners, well, we found these initial growth spurts and then sort of a plateauing effect. For us, that tells us that the training needs to be constantly adjusted, actually, with older adults, so that they can make progress across the whole duration of the training. We worked with computer-assisted language learning in Zurich, and it worked really well. So it really motivated us for a new project where we would love to design online platforms and apps that older adults can use. They were extremely motivated. They needed some technical assistance initially, but it worked very, very well. And one other sort of takeaway message for practitioners is that variation, ups and downs in language acquisition is not only ubiquitous, it's also important. So yes, certain aspects of ups and downs, certain types of intra-individual variation are actually indicative of growth. Something is being restructured, something is going on. And so we should accept the uncertainty surrounding change and development. And then one takeaway message for learners, studies such as ours can help us find out who needs which type of training, whatever cognitive training that is, suits which type of person. Because there's such huge inter-individual variation, you can't, there is no one size fits all. And so we found, for example, that second language learning is really suitable for people with lower cognitive functioning. It's fun for everybody though. So I'd like to end my talk with that, and I hope you're still there. Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simone. It was a great talk. Thanks so much. Obviously, we're all there. Yes, by all means.